Welcome to Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Today I'm going to discuss the relationship of Marxism-Third Worldism or Maoism-Third Worldism, call it what you like, to a specific subject which is near and dear to my heart, and that is autism. I am autistic, as I've said before. Probably not noticeably. Now, I'll tell you, if you would have known me when I was much younger, it would have been very noticeable. And even 20 years ago, it would have been somewhat noticeable. When I was a kid, autism was called, brace yourself, schizophrenia of childhood and adolescence. That's right. They thought that if you were autistic, you were schizophrenic. Well, now we know that's not true. But in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, editions 1 and 2, schizophrenia of childhood and adolescence was literally defined as autism. And it did not begin with the DSM-1. Going back to psychiatric diagnostic manuals of the 1930s, the same definition was used of schizophrenia of childhood and adolescence. Autism. When did that change? It changed in 1980 when there was a shift in perspective in the American Psychiatric Association and among the editors and writers for the DSM from psychoanalysis to behaviorism. Now, in all honesty, I am not a big fan of either one of them, but in this case, behaviorism came to save the day, because at long last, schizophrenia and autism were disconnected. I have a friend, a very close friend, who is autistic. He had the same diagnosis as I did, schizophrenia of childhood and adolescence. He had the same treatments as I did, psychotropic drugs and ECTs, electroconvulsive therapy, also known as electric shock treatments. Till this day, he is being treated as if he is a schizophrenic, not using the DSM-1 and DSM-2 definition, autism, but using the modern day definition of schizophrenia. I recently mentioned that in one of my chats with my own psychiatrist, and he just rolled up his eyes when I told him that. I'm trying to get my friend, who I've been friends with since 1970, to see my own psychiatrist. I'll just call him Doug, because I refer to him as Doug myself, so his name is Doug. Won't use his last name. Really nice guy. And Doug is willing to help my friend Steve. And I'm trying to get them together. It's been a tough hoe. Partially because Steve is hesitant to make any changes. Changes are difficult for autistics. I know they were for me when I was younger. Now, not so much. But when I was a kid, yeah, any kind of change was really tough for me to make. So I can relate to Steve, but Steve really has very little in the way of assertiveness or even aggressiveness, which is certainly not as good as assertiveness. I wish he were more assertive. He lets one of his neighbors bully him around constantly. Just the other day, his neighbor went into the middle of their garden apartment complex, which is a subsidized housing project, and started yelling out, "These are the medications that Steve takes." That's what he did. This guy, well, I am not qualified to diagnose him, but I will just say, in my opinion, this guy appears to me to have some type of antisocial personality disorder, what used to be called psychopathy or sociopathy. I feel really bad for Steve, because Steve does not have the strength of will to challenge him. He feels like it's rude. He doesn't want to challenge him. He leaves his front door open so this jerk can walk into his home and harass Steve constantly. So, that's autism. And with Steve, it's much worse than it is with me. But still, in spite of that, both Steve and I would be called high-functioning autistics on a scale. That's the way it works. There's high-functioning, there's middle-functioning, there's low-functioning. ABC. And so, even though both Steve and I would technically be classified as high-functioning, I am obviously much more high-functioning than he is. I mean, I'm wealthy. Steve is not. Steve is poor. And it's a very difficult situation for the man. I wish there were some way that I could help him. And I do try. He doesn't need financial help. He does okay financially. He can pay his bills. He can pay everything that he needs to pay for on the money he gets from the government. But he can't get the kind of help that he needs from his current psychiatrist, who insists on continuing to define him as a schizophrenic, again, not using the DSM-1 or DSM-2 definition, but using the DSM-5 and DSM-5-TR definition, which is basically somebody who is delusional, of some kind of delusional disorder. So it's a very difficult situation. There is a movement among some autistics, which I once was attracted to only for like a fraction of a second. Well, it's a slight exaggeration. Called the neurodiversity movement, also called the anti-cure movement. And I can understand the attraction. Everyone, or almost everyone, would like to be seen as normal. That's pretty common, right? I mean, I don't know anybody that would not like to be seen as normal. I'm sure there are some people, but nobody that I know. Everyone I know wants to be seen as being normal. And so when I was first diagnosed correctly as being autistic, when that schizophrenia of childhood and adolescence label was taken off of me by the late psychiatrist Jim Hunter, I was overjoyed. I didn't know what it meant, but at least I was no longer schizophrenic, because I didn't understand. How in the world can I be schizophrenic? I have a Ph.D. I'm a professor. I'm not delusional. I never was delusional, even as a kid. It made no sense. And finally, I had somebody who confirmed it. Well, okay. So I was drawn to the neurodiversity anti-cure movement because it basically made me feel like I'm fine. I'm normal. There's nothing wrong with me. In other words, it reaffirmed what Jim Hunter had said to me, what Dr. Jim Hunter had said to me. You know, Jim made it clear to me exactly what my diagnosis should be, which is basically ASD, Autism Spectrum Disorder, as it's called now. He just said autism. The term ASD had not yet been coined or wasn't in common use at that time. OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, PTSD, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder, and Generalized Anxiety Disorder. That is the same diagnosis, or I guess diagnoses, that my current psychiatrist, Doug, has given to me. So both of them agree on that. In fact, when I spoke with my child psychiatrist, who originally gave me the schizophrenia of childhood and adolescence diagnosis as a child over the phone, because he and I had kept touch over the phone. As adults, we got along fine. You know, when I was a kid, he was an adult. He was very intimidating to me. He was not very nice to me much of the time. He was constantly threatening me with being hospitalized again if I didn't do certain things the way he wanted me to do them. But that was gone when I was an adult. And as adults, Buddy, which was his nickname, his name was Charles Rabiner, he's deceased. Buddy and I became good friends, and we got along really, really well. And Buddy agreed with Jim Hunter's diagnosis. I had not yet started seeing my current psychiatrist, Doug, because Jim Hunter was still alive. He died several years later, which is why I needed to find a new psychiatrist. Okay. Now, I can understand, therefore, why some people would like to be seen as being simply neurodiverse. Be at some point along the spectrum of neurodiversity. And in fact, that's true. I mean, you can't argue with that. I mean, we are all neurologically diverse. That's a fact. We are just like we're diverse in other ways. Our bodies are diverse. Our eyes are diverse. Everything about us is diverse. So our brains are diverse too. The problem is that the anti-cure movement in autism wants to take the specific type of neurodiversity called autism and make it normal, normalize it, so that the assumption is that autistics don't need any kind of cure. It's the anti-cure movement. What they need is enablements, things that will help them do better as autistics without changing them from being autistic to, as people in that movement call, neurotypicals, meaning people who are not autistics. That label in and of itself is really misleading. Neurodiverse is a term they use for autistic people. Why only autistic people? Are people with ADHD, people with schizophrenia, people with bipolar disorder, and so on and so on? Are they neurotypical? Of course not. Of course not. They're neurodiverse as well. So it's kind of a biased term. I would even say a self-serving term, and one that I have never really liked or appreciated because I thought it was misleading. But still, I liked the movement because people were, in spite of the fact I had my objections to it, but people were still trying to see themselves as normal. And why not? Why not? But here's the catch. If you see yourself as normal, that means that you see yourself as not in need of a cure. So that's why the neurodiversity movement is also called the anti-cure movement. They are opposed to cures. I was opposed to cures. Now, this is going back like 20 years. This is not recent. This is when I was first re-diagnosed. I was really hostile to the idea of a cure. I thought that was, well, the popular term used in the movement is the movement to cure autism is a type of genocide. You know where that came from? That came from the deaf rights movement, because many deaf people view whatever they call those things, those implants. For some reason, I have a mental block. Those implants that give them a sense of hearing, they call that a type of genocide. Okay, well, again, I'm not deaf. I'm not going to invade on their turf. It's not my place to judge whether cochlear implants, there it is, whether cochlear implants are a type of genocide. If you know anything about the deaf community, it is a very elaborate community. They have their own schools. They have their own communities in many cases. They have their own well-known university. It's a very elaborate system that they have developed. They have fought for a long time in the United States for American Sign Language to be recognized as a regular language. And they were successful in that. And honestly, bravo for them. It should be seen as a regular language. But does that mean that deafness should not be cured? I will pass no judgment. It's none of my business. I will, however, say that I long for a cure, an in vivo cure, meaning a cure in the womb for autism. Because once the baby is out of the womb, the longer it's out of the womb, the more difficult a cure potentially becomes. Because a person becomes acclimated to being a certain way. I mean, like, how in the world could I, at 67 years old, be cured of autism? It's impossible. I'd be terrified of it. I don't know what I would be after that. Would my personality suddenly change? Would I lose the interest that I have right now? I mean, I'm functioning okay now, basically. Not entirely. I still have my issues, but I'm afraid the problems might get worse if I were cured. So I'm not interested in a cure personally, but I do think that cures for fetuses, meaning in vivo, not to be confused with in vitro, which means outside the womb, in vivo cures are a really, really good idea. And that has put me on the outs with the neurodiversity or anti-cure movement. They want nothing to do with me. I think the fact that I have a Ph.D. makes me even a bigger threat, although I don't say anything generally bad about them. Well, I haven't in a long time until now. I hope they don't see this. Well, if they do, so what? Let them see it. Fine, okay. But I've kept myself out of the limelight, maybe off the target for a long time, because I have no interest in attacking these people. I think they have a right to believe whatever they want. If they want to promote anti-cure, neurodiversity, all that stuff, good for them. It's not my concern. But what I think about, what about all of the autistics who are not so-called high-functioning, like I was, even though realistically I was not high-functioning. I mean, it's a relative concept. I could barely function. I could barely talk. I could barely do anything. I was afraid of my own mind. My mind was keeping me in prison. My problem was not outside of me, which the anti-cure people claim, namely lack of accommodations and bullying. My major problem was inside my head. So I lived through that, as almost all autistics have to one extent or another. And it was certainly not pleasant. I'm grateful that I am where I am right now. There was no guarantee. My child psychiatrist, Charles Rabiner, predicted that I would spend the rest of my life on public assistance. Fortunately, he was wrong. Fortunately, I got a Ph.D. and became a college professor. So fortunately, he was wrong. But there were no guarantees. Now, I don't know why he was so certain about that. I should have asked him that question. Never did. He's deceased now. But he was pretty certain about it. I assume he was basing it on people maybe with my same diagnosis, and just assuming that I would end up the same as they were. I don't know. I'm just surmising. But then you have these low functioning autistics. Skip the middle functioning, in between, right? So we'll skip them for the time being. Not to neglect them, but just for the sake of time. I imagine that many or most of you have seen pictures of these people. They sit in the corner of a room, in many cases, and bang their heads against the wall. That is their day. Banging their heads against the wall. Now, do they want to do that? I don't know. I would imagine in most cases probably not. But their minds are so tortured. Their autism is so bad. And autism is primarily a disorder of communication and cognition. And you notice I'm wearing an Honor Neurodiversity t-shirt because I want to pay tribute to the idea of neurodiversity. There's nothing wrong with neurodiversity. The problem is assuming that neurodiversity means that autism should not be cured. So I think about these poor people who are sitting and banging their heads against the wall, who some of whom can barely talk, maybe just make a few words. Some of them have intellectual disabilities as well. I'm not a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist, so I can't speak to that specifically. But, I mean, whenever I would go to autism meetings, meaning meetings for autistics, those people were never there. They were never there. It was always the high-functioning autistics speaking, in effect, on behalf of all autistics, that autism should not be cured. What about those folks? What about those poor folks who bang their heads against the wall? They should not be cured? When I realized that, I left the anti-cure movement. I kind of left it in a fit of anger. Now, I didn't express that anger to anybody else, just inside my head. I was really angry. I felt like I was deceived. Was I deceived? No, I wasn't deceived, but I felt like I was deceived. I was deceived by their propaganda, but I bought into their propaganda. Nobody forced me to. I'm not a stupid person. I'm a brilliant man, genius, with a former college professor. Nobody made me do anything. I did what I wanted to do. And so I literally, I had no right to be angry at anybody. But I was. I was angry because I felt I had been tricked, even though I really hadn't been tricked. I had simply confronted people with a particular point of view, which I think is not a particularly helpful one, the anti-cure idea, and I accepted it, which I don't anymore. Now, how do I relate this to Marxism or Maoism, Third Worldism? Thank you for asking that question, I say to myself. The whole idea of First Worldism is speaking on behalf of others. For decades upon decades, the First World has tried to speak on behalf of the Third World, telling the Third World what they should want, that they should want the same kind of development that we have here in the First World, who their leaders should be. So in 1953, I believe, after Iran had elected Mossadegh as their new president, the United States decided, or the CIA decided, this is now all public information, that they didn't like Mossadegh. Because why? He wanted to nationalize the country's oil. Not good for American oil companies. So they went in, they overthrew the Mossadegh government, and they replaced him with Shah Pahlavi, an American puppet. Now eventually, decades later, in 1979 I believe, Shah Pahlavi was overthrown in a revolution and replaced with Ayatollah Khomeini, the late Ayatollah Khomeini. Now obviously he was no breath of fresh air either, and a lot of Iranians were angry at him. Some tolerated him, but the situation had been resolved back in 1953. They had a really good government. We in the United States destroyed it. we put in our own puppet in there to protect American oil. And so people wonder, why do so many Iranians call the U.S. the Great Satan? That's why. That's why. It's not for some mysterious reason. Most Americans don't know why they use that term. It's because Iranians know their own history. And they know what the United States did to them and how the United States has treated them. Not only them, but how the United States has treated much of the Third World. The United States has been the oppressor of the Third World for many, many decades. Before that, it was Britain and France and whatever. The West has not been very good to the Third World. All right. So, the problem, as I see it, is that the First World needs to get off of its hobby horse. Stop trying to make the world in its own image, and let the Third World speak for itself. To take ourselves entirely out of the picture, to look at ourselves in the mirror, to see our own problems, which are vast and monumental, and then to try to address those problems and stop worrying about what government exists in Iran or what government exists in North Korea, whatever. Stop worrying about that. That's their business. It's not our business. If we had a better UN, maybe the UN, if it wasn't so much under the control of the United States, might be a better arbiter, but we don't. The UN is not a good arbiter. The UN basically stands up for the interests of the US and secondarily Russia. So there is no real fairness in today's world. So that's basically my point in making this video, beginning with autism, showing how the neurodiversity or anti-cure movement is in a similar position to how the First World has reacted in relationship to the Third World. In both cases, you have systems of oppression, whether it's the anti-cure movement not recognizing, not acknowledging the problems of low-functioning autistics who bang their heads against the wall much of the day, or whether it's the United States and other first world countries not giving the right, the freedom to people living in the Third World. This is Mark, by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a good day, or have a good evening.